couple of missing front teeth made him look a little ridiculous though. "Ooh, I know, is this about the festival? That's why you came home, isn't it? The festival starts tomorrow. You're right, our timing was perfect," Shisui said, looking around the village with that innocent smile of hers. Now that they mentioned it, Maomao realized paper streamers and celebratory paper lanterns hung from the eaves of the buildings all around them. Other than the people in light robes who were obviously guests of the baths, everyone seemed to be busy getting ready for something. "Do you have your lantern yet?" the little shit asked. "We only just got back." "Are there any good ones left?" Shisui asked. "Just follow me," he replied, and led her by the hand deeper into the village. Maomao trailed after them. He brought them to a building that was surprisingly beautiful compared to the other plain buildings in the village. Maomao thought it might belong to the village chief, but it was actually an inn. An elaborate signboard outside proclaimed this. Maomao guessed the place looked so impressive because it served as a bathhouse for important visitors. This was where Suhari had meant to bring them. Suhari greeted the master of the house, who answered politely, even cringingly. So maybe that man really was one of the emissaries. Just outside the inn, Maomao saw a palanquin of unusual construction. She thought she recognized one of the men tending to it. He had been one of the emissary's guards. But what would she be doing here? "You are wondering what that emissary is doing here, aren't you?" Suhari said as she collected a key from the innkeeper and came back to them. Maomao looked at her, fighting a shiver of surprise. "Funny you should even know about that," she said, choosing a sarcastic swipe instead of a simple yes. "Just because I was dead doesn't mean I didn't have work to do," Suhari replied. Was that a joke? It was most unusual for her. Suhari seemed somehow different from the callous woman Maomao had known before. Perhaps dying had changed her. She was still thinking about it as they went into the inn. She was led to a room that was so luxurious, one wondered how it had ended up in the middle of the woods. The room was divided into 3 areas. There were 2 bedrooms and a living space. One of the bedrooms had 1 bed, and the other had 2. The room with the single bed had a canopy, which suggested it was for the master, while the other room was for the servants. Shisui headed for the room belonging to the little boy. "Coming, Maomao." Actually, Maomao would have loved to throw herself down on one of the beds and stay there, but she didn't think she could refuse this request. Suhari seemed to have another matter to attend to, but she did not want to leave Maomao by herself. When they stepped into the courtyard, they found the young master directing a group of maids. He was clearly preparing for something. "Will this be sufficient, young master?" "Yeah, I guess so." Maomao looked over and saw a collection of masks and bundles of flowering plants. The masks were all shaped like fox faces. Some were larger and some were smaller, but they were all pure white. The grasses included pampas, ears of rice and buckwheat. There was also lantern plant, though it wasn't currently in season. This plant had long since withered, but it hadn't lost its color. It remained vivid. Shisui smiled and picked it up. The little boy gave a shy chuckle and rubbed the spot under his nose. "I know you love that, sis," he said. "I worked hard to find one." "Yeah, right, you mean the women did." Maomao peered at a white fox mask. It was carved from wood and the surface was carefully polished. A brush and pigments were nearby. "It seemed you were supposed to paint the mask however you liked." Shisui said, "Thank you, I do." "But you weren't the one who found it, were you, Kairu-yu?" She had taken the words right out of Maomao's mouth. The little boy named Kairu-yu, looking even more embarrassed, turned toward the maids and mumbled, "Thank you." Ho, so he had a halfway decent side after all. Maomao thought she might promote him from little shit to just brat. Very nice. Shisui grabbed the kid and rubbed his head vigorously. "Ow, ow, sis, that hurts." The kid did not sound all that upset though, maybe because he was crammed up against Shisui's chest. He was a child, but he was also clearly a boy. Maomao turned away from the playful scene and began painting one of the fox masks. Chapter 12, Lantern Plant. When they arrived at the rear palace that day, the air felt different. Jinchi headed for the Jade Pavilion, with Gaeshun and several other eunuchs following him. Consort Jayukayu had seemed unwell for the past several days. This morning, word arrived that she might give birth at any time. Maomao's adoptive father, the man called Liumen, had been constantly attending the consort, but the baby would not come. The question remained whether the baby would be born breech. This was the main reason Luhmen had been summoned from the pleasure district. No one had officially said the consort was giving birth, but the tension at the Jade Pavilion suggested everyone knew. Other palace ladies tried to peek into the residence. When they realized Jinchi was there, they turned red and quickly returned to work. It had been 10 days since Maomao disappeared. Jinchi was greeted by Hongyang, who looked somewhat worn out as she led them into the pavilion. In the hallway, a large wash basin sat near a teapot heating over a brazier. It was ready for the moment the child was born. They had obviously prepared in case the delivery went quickly. "How is she?" Jinchi asked, forcing himself to sound calm and collected. The ladies in waiting looked at him uneasily. However, it was the elderly man emerging from the room who gave him the details. "The contractions have stopped for the moment. I cannot tell yet when the child might be born. It could, in principle, happen any time, although it would still be somewhat early at this point. And how is the mother? The consort is still alert and calm. At this moment I do not think there is any danger of a breech birth, so Maomao's treatments had helped. That was a relief, but they were not out of the woods yet. There were still too many variables. Another man was in the hallway with them. He was dressed in a doctor's outfit and had a thin moustache. He was the rear palace's official physician, but at that moment he was little more than an obstacle. The ladies in waiting seemed to resent having him there. At his feet was a cat. It was too old to be called a kitten anymore. Maomao was now a proper young feline. Jinchi couldn't help wondering whether that was sanitary, but the cat helped distract Princess Lingli. She was otherwise desperate to go to her mother, so perhaps it was a net good. Normally the rear palace could have gotten along without its doctor, but at this moment Jinchi was glad to have him there. The man's expression was easy to read. He clearly wanted to be of service, and he was distressed that Maomao was still missing. This combination seemed likely to cause simple mistakes. Therefore, the ladies in waiting of the Jade Pavilion had ordered him to stand in one place and not move. Seeing someone so obviously distraught, even more so than he was, actually helped calm Jinchi down. This allowed him to set aside his mounting panic. "Very well," Jinchi said. "I will take my leave for the moment then. If anything happens, send a messenger." "Yes, sir," the grandmotherly eunuch said with a bow. Gaeshun appeared at almost the same moment Luhmen withdrew. "Master Jinchi," he said. Jinchi had sent him to see the matron of the serving women regarding a separate matter. "Yes, what is it?" "Ahem." Gaeshun glanced around, indicating this discussion should be held privately. The delivery might resume at any moment, but Jinchi could hardly stand there indefinitely. Therefore he left 2 eunuchs and then excused himself from the Jade Pavilion. "What is it?" "It is about the vanished eunuch. I asked the other eunuchs if they knew anything about the matter. The missing eunuch had gone by the name Tian, meaning heaven. It was a common name. One might hear it anywhere. Reports were that Tian had not been very close to the other eunuchs. He was very handsome and often surrounded by palace women. However, there was another side to his personality. Of all the eunuchs freed from slavery to the barbarians, he was the only one who did not have other personal acquaintances in the group. It was possible he had joined them before they reached the rear palace. The safest assumption was that this had been his plan from the beginning. It explained why Tian had intentionally avoided getting close to anyone. It also meant they were losing time without gaining any useful information. One eunuch mentioned seeing someone he believed was Tian praying at a shrine. That was not unusual. The rear palace had many shrines, both large and small. A prayer now and then was the least one would expect from a devout believer. Yes, but Gaeshun produced a diagram of the rear palace from the folds of his robe. He pointed to a shrine in the northern quarter. "That is," Jinchi began. It was a shrine dedicated to honoring those who had died in the rear palace, the very place where Consort Jin's funeral had been held. Usually those who died here were returned to their families. However, some had nowhere to go even after death. Jinchi immediately turned toward the northern quarter. The man I spoke to said Tian was visiting a grave. Whose grave? He wasn't sure, unfortunately. Jinchi grunted and crossed his arms. He decided to go and inspect the place himself. He had other things to do, but he just could not let this go. There was a deep horror of death in the rear palace. This was where the future sons of heaven were to be born and raised. Of course, the inhabitants would wish to distance themselves from anything as inauspicious as death. At the same time, those who served the privileged had a custom. Those who had lain with the emperor once could never leave the rear palace as long as they lived. There were exceptions, of course. Consorts were sometimes given to underlings for political reasons, or as a reward for loyal service. Mostly, though, these women were the daughters of powerful people. A mere maid whose blossom withered on the branch, who never produced any offspring, could expect to simply fade away here in this garden. Her name would be recorded and remembered nowhere. The place Jinchi was now going was where those flowers slept. There weren't even 10 grave markers there, though he didn't know whether that was many or few. All of them belonged to women who had served in the palace during the time of the previous emperor. The overseers of the rear palace had decided, and you could call it capricious if you must, that too many interments would soon become a problem. When they arrived, they discovered someone was already there. It was most unusual for anyone to visit the grave of nameless palace women. They could see from a distance that the visitor was an older woman. She was sitting in front of the nearest, comparatively newer grave marker. This woman was perhaps more than 40 years old and had a face that conveyed strength. Before the grave were flowers she must have picked somewhere, and a branch of a lantern plant. Jinchi would have said it was slightly out of season. Maybe someone else had left it there earlier. The woman stood up, and that was when she noticed Jinchi and Gaeshun. Her eyes went wide for just a second, but then they returned to normal. She bowed politely before moving to make her exit. There was nothing inherently wrong with visiting the grave. They had no reason to suspect her of anything, except for one thing. As the woman walked by, Jinchi caught a strong whiff of alcohol. It was very strong, as if he might get drunk just from smelling it. He thought of those foreign distilled spirits. Almost before he knew it, he grabbed her wrist. She couldn't hide her shock. Nonetheless, she managed to sound calm as she said, "Can I help you, sir?" Jinchi would not normally have done something so impulsive. He should have thought about what he was doing before he grabbed a palace woman's arm. He had believed he was perfectly calm, but now he knew he had been more unsettled than he thought. "Where is Maomao?" he asked. He felt the woman tense. Gaeshun and the other eunuchs watched them silently. "Calm down," Jinchi told himself. He had to calm down. When he spoke again, it was with his customary honeyed tone. He said he was curious to find out about a certain freckled palace woman. "Do you happen to know anything about her?" He used the smile that often got him what he wanted from the palace women. But this woman did not smile back. Instead, the blood drained from her face. She looked as though she had seen a goblin. Shenel's pupils had grown larger. Jinchi could feel her pulse racing where he held her wrist. She knew something. He was certain of it. He gripped her arm tighter so she could not escape. The woman looked at him, her eyes wide. Perhaps she had foreign blood because her eyes were green. Suddenly she gazed at him, but her look turned distant. She said, "An old memory has come back to me. Someone calls to me with a kind voice and gives me sweet candies from a foreign land." Huge tears began to roll down her cheeks, but Jinchi couldn't follow what she was saying. No one seems to remember what he looked like when he was young. "All I have heard is that by the time he was old, he was but a shadow of his former self. He stopped coming to see me after I was 14, so I know nothing of what he looked like after that time." Who was the woman talking about? What was she saying and why? Jinchi could see that even deeper than the green hue in the woman's eyes was anger. She said, but he too had a voice like honey and a face like a celestial nymph's. There was conviction in her voice. "Why would someone like you pretend to be a eunuch?" Jinchi's grip loosened for just a moment, but it was all Shenel needed. She shook him off and began to run. She had never really hoped to escape, though. With the eunuchs all around, she was soon apprehended. "What shall we do with her, Master Jinchi?" asked the man who had captured her. As he spoke, the woman took a small bottle from her robe. She uncorked it and drank the contents. Gaeshun shouted even before Jinchi did, "Make her vomit that out." He told one of the eunuchs to bring water. He held on to the collapsed woman himself and jammed his fingers into her mouth, trying to make her throw up. Jinchi could only watch. Master Jinchi, he was momentarily startled by Gaeshun's shouting. He must have been completely lost in thought. The eunuch was already back with the water and was pouring it down the woman's throat. The bottle she had drunk from was rolling on the ground. Jinchi recognized the vessel. It was one of those Maomao used for her distilled alcohol. This was extremely strong alcohol, a poison in itself, and this woman had just drunk an entire bottle of it. The wind gusted, blowing away the flowers in front of the grave and shaking the lantern plant berries. Gaeshan asked forcefully, Master Jinchi, what do you want us to do? Jinchi suddenly realized the other man's creased brow was practically in front of his eyes. Master Jinchi, you need to get a hold of yourself. Surely you know that. You need not be troubled by a palace woman's little joke. Joke? Jinchi asked. Who would drink a vial of poison as a joke? Hadn't all of this started because Jinchi had impulsively grabbed her arm? And had the person the woman had spoken of truly been Gaeshan? Did he indeed resemble him? The thought had always bothered Jinchi, ever since he was young. He did not look like that person. He didn't resemble his older brother or his mother either. So who did he resemble? This question fueled baseless rumors among the ladies in waiting. Stories circulated about his illegitimacy. It was almost laughable. What was he doing here in this garden full of women? He had asked his elder brother to allow him to take on this eunuch identity. He wanted to cast aside his status as heir apparent. It was ridiculous, plain and simple. Still frustrated with himself, he went and stood by the grave marker Shenel had been visiting. He felt like laughing, but he still had work to do. Slowly he knelt by the marker. He picked up the red pod of the lantern plant where it had fallen. It was dried out now that its season was over. The pod had begun to tear, revealing the red fruit inside. He remembered hearing that lantern plant could help induce an abortion. When he saw the name carved into the gravestone, a name that would one day be erased by the passage of time, he thought he understood why someone would have offered the plant there. Tehu. It was a perfectly ordinary name for a serving woman. These days, not so much in the capital, but in the countryside, women were naming their daughters Tehu. Here, though, on this grave marker, the name was unforgettable. It was the name of a serving woman who had died last year. A woman found her only joy in the cloistered world of the rear palace by gathering groups of women to tell scary stories. She had no family at all, with one exception. If the daughter born from her assignation with the palace doctor had lived, it would be Tehu. The missing eunuch and serving woman. And no, he still did not have all the pieces of this puzzle, but his intuition enabled him to fill in the gaps, and slowly intuition became certainty. Jinchi knew where he had to go next. If a child born at that time had survived, they would now be 2 years older than the emperor. Let us suppose the banished doctor had taken the child with him. They were said to have disappeared after that, but that was questionable. Something about it did not quite fit. The woman named Tehu had been a servant to one of the consorts. She served Lulan's mother, Shishu's wife. Tehu was said to have been related to the Shi clan. She was a distant relative of Lulan's mother. Perhaps she would know something about the child. This child was born to a serving woman and the vanished doctor, Jinchi thought. He then turned toward the garnet pavilion. There was no hint of the austerity that had pervaded the pavilion until the previous year. Instead, the place overflowed with ostentatious exoticism. Jinchi sighed privately, then made himself put on his usual smile. A lady in waiting bowed to him, almost shyly, and led him inside. They passed through a hallway lined with garish mother-of-pearl baubles, then came to the receiving room where he was normally seen. The mistress of the pavilion was lounging on her couch, as usual, polishing her nails. Jinchi allowed his eyes to crinkle in a smile. Consort Lulan was attended by 6 ladies in waiting. They were all assiduously seeking to fulfill her every need. Each was dressed in a flamboyant outfit. Today's theme seemed to be traditional clothing of the island nation to the east. Each of the women wore a collection of layered robes. It was a garish sight. The women were so thoroughly covered that you could not even see the shapes of their bodies. At the same time, they had applied makeup around their eyes. This made them appear wide-eyed and angry, giving their faces an angular look. The overall effect was odd at best. Jinchi thought it made them look like smirking foxes. He found himself wondering what compelled Lulan and her ladies to dress in such outrageous ways. Was she aware that the emperor found it off-putting? Lulan, Jinchi knew, understood her place as a high consort very well. She understood her place as Shishu's daughter even better. Lulan whispered something to one of her ladies in waiting. She held up a folding fan made of feathers to hide her mouth. Jinchi thought their way of speaking to each other was very refined, but it wasn't just that. He had come here hoping for the smallest chance of success. This gave him an appreciation for details he might have otherwise missed. The mole on Lulan's temple, for example. She had tried to hide it with makeup, but it was still faintly visible. Perhaps sweat had diluted the white powder somewhat. If Jinchi remembered correctly, Lulan did not have a mole on her temple. He did not bother to sit in the chair the lady in waiting offered him. He walked directly toward Consort Lulan. "What is the matter?" one of the ladies asked, sounding angry. "Surely even you, Master Jinchi, should observe some decorum. What was the woman's name again?" Jinchi prided himself on knowing how many women worked in each of the pavilions. He knew their names and where they came from.